Hi, I'm Arnie Skelton, and each week in this podcast series I'm going to offer you my top 10 tips on particular topics or themes that might be of interest to you as a teacher or manager or both. Hi, and welcome to this week's podcast, which, as last week, is going to be slightly different and is again influenced heavily by the fact that we're all in lockdown and social distancing and isolation due to coronavirus. So it's now May, and this has been going on for quite a while, 8 weeks perhaps. And so I thought I'd provide my top 10 of things you might like to read or watch during this difficult time. I think all of these 10 things are really worth having a look at and may give you something to think about as well as entertain you during this quite difficult period. So here are my top 10 books, videos, films and one TV series that you might want to have a look at. Okay, to start with then, let's have a look at 4 books. The first of these, and my absolute favourite book, is called Being Happy, and it's by Andrew Matthews. Now, Andrew Matthews was initially, and still is of course, a professional cartoonist and turned to personal development late in the day. And this book is brilliant. I endorse everything on every page, and I would recommend that this book is handed out to primary school children, really. I think we'd all be better as adults if we had access to this as early as possible. So it's Andrew Matthews, Being Happy. My second book, tip number 2, is Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl, F-R-A-N-K-L. Viktor Frankl. He's an Auschwitz survivor. It's quite a small book, but deeply profound and moving. And the essence of his book is that externally, freedoms and rights and benefits, if you like, can all be taken away. And of course, that's clearly the case of anybody who was in Auschwitz. And he'll say, they took away my freedom, they took away my family, they took away my health, they took away my nourishment in terms of food and drink. But the one thing they couldn't take away was what was going on inside his head and how he processed that and the meaning he gave to those events. So that, for example, because he was regarded as something of a stubborn prisoner, the guards would give him less to eat than the others in his work group. And right in front of them, whatever he was given, he would break it in half and give half to somebody else he thought more needy in the group. What he's doing throughout his stay in Auschwitz is retaining control through choice. He may not have choice in much of the external world he operates in, but he has a choice about how he thinks, how he feels, and what he wants to do with what he's got. It's an immensely moving and inspiring book. Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl is tip number 2. Tip number 3 is a book, completely in contrast with that, is any of the Calvin and Hobbes cartoon series, all available in various books, and the author of them is Bill Watterson. Bill, then W-A-T-T-E-R-S-O-N, Bill Watterson. He's the creator of Calvin and Hobbes. Very funny cartoon strip and quite insightful. Peanuts by Charles Schulz does something similar, but somehow Calvin and Hobbes for me just has the extra edge. If you've never tried him, Bill Watterson, you've never seen Calvin and Hobbes, be prepared to be both surprised and kind of inspired again. At the surface level, he offers just funny cartoon strips, but they're quite significant in terms of relationships, and they're very thought-provoking. So, tip number 3, the Calvin and Hobbes cartoons by Bill Watterson. And my final book, my tip number 4, is the book by Susan Jeffers that really was seminal for me in my thinking and my career. And the book is Feel the Fear and Do It Anyway. If any of you struggle in any way with fear or anxiety or self-doubt, this is the book I would completely recommend. It's hugely influential for me and for many others that I've recommended it to. So, Susan Jeffers, Feel the Fear and Do It Anyway. Moving now on to 3 videos. Tip number 5 is the video of Steve Jobs giving his address to students at Stanford University. He's in his pomp and prime at this stage, and it's about 20 minutes long, so it's not particularly short, but it's fabulous. And in it he tells really 3 stories. He's a gifted storyteller, as many great leaders are. And I won't want to spoil any of it. I simply recommend it to you in 2 ways. One, because the stories he tells are profound and personal and inspiring. And also, he's a gifted storyteller. He's extremely fluent, extremely articulate, and great control over words. So he's very skilled at what he's doing. That's Steve Jobs and his Stanford address. Tip number 6 is possibly, I think, the greatest video ever made, which is Ben Zander's video, and it's of the transformational power of classical music. It's a TED talk, and if you just search Zander and music and TED, then you'll get it. The transformational power of classical music. And it's only partly about classical music, so don't let that put you off if you're not a classical music fan. That's just really a backdrop, a way in to a magnificent and moving presentation by Ben Zander. All I would say is, please do watch it and have a handkerchief or some tissues nearby. It is fantastic. Okay, that's tip number 6, Ben Zander. And tip number 7, for complete contrast, is Eddie Izzard's Death Star Canteen presentation. It's done as a Lego story, which in itself is quite funny, but he's brilliant at this, and it always makes me laugh. So whatever's going on in my world, if I just want to cheer myself up, I can't help smiling and laughing whenever I play this. It's only a 5-minute little video. It's got some fairly fruity language in it, but that's Eddie Izzard. It's just magnificent. So if you've never seen Death Star Canteen, search for it on Google and watch it. It's a load of fun. Moving on now to 2 films that I would recommend. There's loads of films, and I'm sure you'll have your own. And I've just limited it to 2 because I want to keep this to a top 10 list. And tip number 8 is Lion, Lion. Tremendous film. It's a kind of man's search for meaning in the modern world. It's nothing to do with Auschwitz or survival, but it is about a quest for somebody to find his family and to some extent himself. That sounds a little bit heavy. It isn't, and it's set primarily in India, but latterly in New Zealand, and the photography is stunning and the acting is fabulous. And it's a great watch, I think, for the whole family. So that's tip number 8, Lion. Tip number 9, I think it has to be my favourite film of all time, and that's hard to say when there are so many contenders, but it's The Shawshank Redemption. I suspect many of you listening to this will know that film and love it as I do. Based on a Stephen King novella, brilliant in every respect, great acting, great storytelling, great production, an immense movie, and if you haven't seen it, please give it a go. The Shawshank Redemption. And then my final tip number 10, is of a TV series. And if I could recommend 2, it would be this one and West Wing. West Wing, if you haven't seen it, is just fantastic. Very political, brilliantly written, and a great watch. But the one I'm choosing is a UK TV series. Often Americans do them better, or tend to. This is Line of Duty, and this is the police at their best and worst, and central to the whole series, I'm not quite sure how many series there were, I think half a dozen, is the interrogation room, which is like a chess match between the person being investigated and the persecutors. And it's worth watching just for those scenes alone. Brilliantly written by Jed Mercurio and brilliantly acted throughout. So that's tip number 10, Line of Duty. So, just a quick recap of my top 4 books, Being Happy, number 1. Number 2, Man's Search for Meaning. Tip number 3, the Calvin and Hobbes cartoon series. And tip number 4, Feel the Fear and Do It Anyway. My 3 videos, tip number 5, Steve Jobs' Stanford Address. Tip number 6, Ben Zander and the Transformative Power of Classical Music. And tip number 7, Eddie Izzard's Death Star Canteen. Can't even say that without smiling. Tip number 8 is 2 films. Number 8 is Lion, and tip number 9 is The Shawshank Redemption. And finally, to recommend a series, tip number 10, the UK's Line of Duty. If you've seen all of those, well, I'm sorry to offer you nothing new, but I'm sure if you have seen them, you'll know they're brilliant. And if there are any on that list that you haven't accessed, then I'm recommending them. So that's it for this week. Thanks for listening. Bye. Thank you for listening. If you've enjoyed this podcast, make sure you subscribe. You will still get the podcast for free, but you will also get an alert to let you know when the next podcast is available. And please recommend the podcast to anyone else you think might like it and benefit from it. Also, I'd really appreciate it if you could leave a review and any other comment, because they'll help promote the podcast series on the relevant platform. So, bye for now.